Today we are going to have a little introduction to the nervous system. So first, let's talk about some neural signaling. So what is a neuron? It is a specialized nerve cell, and its function is to communicate between different parts of the nervous system. So this allows organisms to receive and respond to internal and external stimuli. So we're very familiar with the external stimuli, where if we touch something hot, we can feel that it's hot and we remove our hand. Or if we're experiencing pain, we feel the pain and we can respond to that pain. Same thing with pleasure. And similarly, we are having the same sort of regulation happening in our body. We just aren't always aware of it. So what is neural signaling? It is communication through neurons. So reception is the detection of a stimulus. So for example, if you touch something that is smooth, you feel its texture is smooth. Neurons and specialized sensory receptors contain these receptors. So for example, in your skin, and we'll learn more about this later on, you have special receptors that are going to feel different types of touch. So pain, we have different types of pain receptors, for example, or even just the hairs on your body allows you to feel when something touches you gently. We also have sensory receptors in our eyes that allow us to detect light, and in our ears that allow us to detect sound. Transmission is the movement of messages along a neuron to another neuron or to the target muscle or gland. Integration is the sorting and interpreting of messages, and this occurs in the brain. And then the response is lunchtime. The output that occurs in your body, so potentially releasing hormones, or even shivering if you are cold to help increase your body temperature, or some sort of action that you are aware of due to your brain interpreting information that was received from the receptors. So there's 3 types of neurons that we're going to talk about. So again, 3 types of neurons. We have afferent neurons, and their function is to transmit stimuli collected by sensory receptors. So they're collecting the information from those initial sensory receptors. So again, looking at, let's keep it simple with your hand in touch, they would be the neurons that are coming from your hand and going along your body. And they're also known as sensory neurons. So they are taking that information from the environment, so from your hand. Interneurons collect information and formulates a response. They are found primarily in the brain and the spinal cord. This comprises 99% of human neurons. So your afferent neurons are taking in the information, and they are sending that information up to the brain. And then interneurons send information and tell information to efferent neurons. These carry the response signal from the brain, the interneurons, to effectors. So these would be the muscles or glands. And again, if your hand is touching something hot or something sharp that would be painful, that information is sent via afferent neurons up to the brain. The brain says, hey, starter, stop doing that, it hurts. Message is sent through efferent, have to be told, efferent neurons, and then you would say, ow, move your hand. There's a little bit of a rule that kind of goes against that when we talk about reflexes. So efferent neurons are called motor neurons, and again, they send signals to skeletal muscles. And again, glands as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the unit. So looking at some information processing. So we see this diagram here. I'll use this diagram as I explain information processing. So we have a stimulus, and this could be external or internal stimulus. And so external we're very familiar with. So again, like I said, touching something sharp or hot, or just being in a cold environment or a hot environment. That's all external, outside of us. Internal things could be food that you've eaten. And what we talk about in this course a lot is water balance when we talk about the kidneys, and also our sugar levels. So we're going to be learning about diabetes and how our glucose levels are controlled in our body. And so these things we don't pay so much attention to, other than we might have to eat or drink some water. So that would, something we'll talk about a little bit later, but a lot is happening in our body that we're not always aware of. So we have a stimulus that is either internal or external, and this message is transmitted to interneurons via afferent neurons. So we have a stimulus, and it's felt by afferent neurons, and this gets sent into our interneurons in the brain. And there could be a couple connections between interneurons, and we'll learn a little bit more about how the brain is made up and the different parts of the brain and their functions a little bit later in the unit. So this integration happens in the brain, and this is taking the information given to it and making some sort of sense of it. From there, you're getting a response, and that response is being sent via efferent neurons to the effectors. And these, again, would be the muscles or the glands, and that produces some sort of action. So a quick example that we'll look at is if you're cold. So the stimulus would be cold. That information is sent from all of the sensors in your body via afferent neurons to your brain. And we'll talk again about brain regions that control your response to temperature. And your brain says, I'm cold, we need to do something about this. And the brain is going to then tell your body to do certain things. And one of them is to start shivering. And your effectors would be muscles. Your muscle cells are going to start shivering to try to increase your body temperature. So the action would be shivering. The effectors would be the muscles. So the structure of a neuron could be reviewed from grade 10. It is probably the coolest looking cell, if you ask me. So here is the average neuron, and we're going to go from left to right. And so we have our cell body here. I would say this is like the main focus. The center, I would say this is the center, and of course it contains the nucleus and the other organelles. We also have these branching off, coming off of the cell body, which are dendrites. So dendrites are actually receiving information from other neurons. So these are making connections with a whole bunch of other neurons. We also have the axon, which is going to be taking information, if you will, from other neurons and sending a signal from the cell body down along the axon, down to the axon terminals. The axon hillock is the specific junction at the cell body where the signal axons arise. So it's just the connection between the cell body and the axon. It's got a special name, the axon hillock. So this is the axon where the signal from that neuron is going to travel along, and then we get to the axon terminals. These are branches at the end of this neuron that are going to make connections with either other neurons and send that information continuing, or with the muscle or target gland. So a nerve are many axons that are bundled together to form nerve fibers, and so we call these nerves. They branch extensively throughout the periphery of the entire body. So let's talk about some more structure of the neuron. So we talked about the basic structure of the neuron with the dendrites, the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminal. But there's actually a whole lot more going on. And you might remember this from our first unit. I think I literally took this slide and put it in there, but we'll talk about it again. So electrical signals, we're going to talk about in a couple lessons. They're produced in the cell body of a neuron. So again, this part of the neuron. Ions are going to flow down their concentration gradients through channels in the plasma membrane. And it's going to happen between here and here and here and here at these specific spots. Glial cells provide nutrition and support to neurons, and they retain capacity to divide. They're a source of nearly all brain tumors. We don't see them in this diagram, but glial cells would be surrounding this neuron here. So they're just like more of a normal shaped cell that are just around the area. Okay, we also have Schwann cells. Love it. They form tightly wrapped layers of plasma membrane. So these would be a Schwann cell that are wrapped around the axon of a neuron. They produce a myelin sheath, if you remember this from Unit 1. So it creates insulation that is going to cover the Schwann cells. So if you remember from Unit 1, we have like a normal cell, and then it has this big, long extension of the plasma membrane, and that wraps around this neuron. And it does that to create an insulation, because you can think of neurons almost like wires, and they need insulation to properly function. They have a high lipid content, which is why I talked about it in Unit 1. We have these nodes of Ranvier here, and it's the spaces between each of those Schwann cells. These gaps are where we actually have the electrical signals being able to be produced. So it exposes the axon membrane to the extracellular fluid. This allows for rapid conduction of the nerve impulses, which we're going to talk about in not the next lesson, but the lesson after that. So let's review the neural circuit. So again, we have connections between the terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, or the another cell body. So any kind of information that the body is receiving, again, either internally or externally, is going to first be sent to afferent neurons. And you remember A comes first. So afferent, A comes first in the alphabet. A is awesome. That sends information to one or more interneurons. So there could be more than one interneuron in your brain receiving information. And then that is going to send a response information to the efferent neuron. Interneurons may receive information from several afferent neurons. So again, we saw how many connections that a neuron can make. At each one of those dendrites, it could be making a connection with another neuron. So it can be getting a lot of different information from a lot of different neurons. And that's why the brain has so much work to do. It's got to make sense of what's going on. Interneurons may connect to several efferent neurons. So we saw at the axon terminal, there was more than one branch coming off that end. So there could be more than one connection to efferent neurons. And so we look here, this guy sees this water, it's probably like, hey, I'd like some water, send some information. The brain's like, yep, we're a little low on water. Let's tell that arm to use its big bicep, pick up that water, and take a drink. Okay, remember I said there was like a little trick, or not even a trick, but like a rule that was maybe being broken, and that's with the reflex arc. So reflexes are really cool. And we're just going to talk briefly about how they work. So what is a reflex? So a reflex is something that is just going to happen naturally without actually having to think about it. And that's they're really unique, and we'll talk about why. So the neural circuit, like I said, is the coordination of the receptor. So again, the hand or seeing the water. The afferent neuron, which is going to be taking that information and sending it to the interneuron or neurons, which are going to then make a decision about what to do and send that information through efferent neurons and send it to the effector, which would be muscle or glands, and create a response. Reflex arc is a neural circuit that travels through the spinal cord but does not require the coordination of the brain. So that means you're essentially taking information and having a response immediately without the brain having to make any kind of information, take in any information and make a decision. So normally we have afferent neurons, which are, again, taking in some sort of stimulus. They are going to send the information through interneurons and immediately go to efferent neurons. And this, again, is through the spinal cord, not the brain. So these would be interneurons in the spinal cord, but not to the brain. They also send information to the brain, but it's slower. So why does this happen? You put your hand on something that is like burning your hand, you take it off so fast, you sometimes don't even feel it right away. It's just like, oh my gosh, that's hot, without even saying that. And you sometimes have a delayed sense of pain, and then the pain kicks in. So when that happens, your body first had this reflex arc. So information went to the spinal cord and immediately told your hand to leave that space. There was also information that went to the brain, and then your brain was like, that hurts, and you have that delayed pain. So using this diagram, we are going to talk about the reflex arc. First, we have our hand that is containing pain receptors, and it touches a hot surface. The pain receptors stimulate an afferent neuron, and the afferent neuron transmits the impulses to the spinal cord. We're going to talk about the spinal cord and its structure and its involvement in the nervous system a little bit later. But in the spinal cord, there are interneurons, and one part of the interneurons are going to make direct connections to efferent neurons that are going to bypass the brain. And so one afferent neuron is going to stimulate the flexor muscle to contract, so the bicep muscle to contract, and the other neuron sends inhibitory signals to keep the extensor muscle from contracting, i.e. the tricep. Okay, so it doesn't even really matter about which is which, just that it is telling forcing your arm to move up away from the stimulus. At the same time, though, we see there is another connection happening, and this interneuron is going to be sending information to the brain. And so this is where we get that delayed response or delayed feeling of pain. So you move your hands quickly here, going in this pathway, the reflex arc, but you're still going to sadly feel the pain because information is sent to your brain and it just took a little bit longer. This allows us to quickly respond to our environment and keep ourselves safe.